You're a German fighter pilot in 1940, strapped into a Messerschmitt Bf 109. At this moment, you feel untouchable. Look at the map behind you. Poland fell. Denmark fell. Norway fell. Belgium, the Netherlands, France, gone one after another in shockingly fast campaigns. Your country's propaganda says you're on the winning side of history, and honestly, everything you've seen makes that easy to believe. Ahead is the English Channel, a strip of water. That's all that's left between your squadron and the last enemy that still dares to stand up. Your briefings have been crystal clear. British morale is cracking. The Royal Air Force is supposedly down to scraps. Just a few hundred tired aircraft flown by inexperienced kids who don't have the stomach for real combat. You've been told Britain is basically begging for it to end. So you do what you've been trained to do. You line up with your formation, tight spacing, perfect discipline. You push the throttle. The engine pulls hard. The coastline of France slides away, and the channel opens under you like a cold, gray ditch. And then, about 20 minutes later, that confident story starts to fall apart. You're over the green fields of southeast England, Kent, when the sky suddenly becomes violent. Tracer rounds stitch upward. Shapes flash through the haze. Brown and green camouflage fighters cutting across your nose so close you can make out the metal panels and rivet lines. You snap into the turn to chase, stick back, feet working the pedals, eyes searching for the target's next move. But something feels wrong, not in your hands, in your head. Because you glance behind you, where you expect to see friendly aircraft holding formation, and for a split second you see nothing. Then you hear it. Not panic, not screaming, just calm voices over the radio. British voices calling positions like they're reading directions on a road trip. Casual, almost bored, like this is routine. And that's when your stomach drops. Because people who are finished don't sound like that. People who are desperate don't wait for you over their own fields with altitude, timing, and confidence. In that moment, you realize the RAF hasn't collapsed. It's been watching. It's been learning. And it's about to make you pay for every lie you were fed in the briefing room. If you're into stories where the little details decide who lives and who doesn't, you'll want to stick around. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this series. Now, here's the thing. This fear wasn't just about courage. It wasn't just about who had the better pilots. A huge part of the terror came from machines, specifically how those machines behaved at the exact moment a dogfight turned sharp and ugly. The Bf-109E was a deadly piece of engineering. One advantage mattered more than most people realize: its fuel injection system. In simple terms, it handled sudden dives better. The engine kept feeding fuel properly even when the plane went nose down hard. That meant a German pilot could shove the nose toward the ground and drop instantly, fast, without the engine coughing or cutting out. Across the channel, the RAF's main answer was the Spitfire. Elegant, fast, and built for turning fights. But early in the battle, it had a weakness that German pilots loved to exploit. Many British fighters used carburetors that could struggle under negative G conditions, like when you push forward hard and the plane goes light for a moment. For a pilot, the effect could be terrifying. You push down to follow the enemy, and the engine hesitates. A second of silence where the propeller doesn't pull like it should. In a fight measured in heartbeats, that's a lifetime. German pilots learned a simple routine. You dive. The Brit tries to follow. His engine stumbles. You reverse, come back up, and now he's slow, low, and exposed. At first, it worked often enough to build confidence. It felt like superior design beating inferior design, cold math in the sky. But the RAF adapted. British pilots stopped playing the game the way the 109 wanted. Instead of pushing straight into a dive that could starve their engines, they began using an improvised method, rolling the aircraft inverted before diving, so the forces stayed positive in a way the engine could handle better. It was risky. It felt wrong. It wasn't neat, polished, textbook flying, but it did one thing that mattered more than any manual. It kept them in the fight. Now, from the German cockpit, that change hit like a punch. You look back expecting to see the Spitfire hesitate, fall off, disappear, and instead, it's still there. Coming down hard, closing fast, guns firing, refusing to let you escape the way you used to. That's the first crack in the Luftwaffe's mental armor, the realization that the enemy is not only brave, but flexible, willing to gamble the aircraft itself just to deny you the advantage you counted on. Then comes the second crack, the quieter one, the one you can't dogfight your way out of: fuel. A Bf 109 based in France didn't have endless time over England. Every minute mattered. Take off, climb, form up, cross the channel. Your clock is already running before you even see an enemy. And once you reach the London area, the time left for actual combat can shrink to a small window. Now imagine what that does to your brain in a fight. You're pulling hard turns, your vision narrowing, your body heavy in the seat. Your mouth is dry. Your gloves are slick with sweat, and somewhere on your panel is a fuel situation you cannot ignore, because if you stay too long, the channel is waiting under you, and the channel does not forgive. Now, the RAF understood this, and they started to treat it like a hunting trick. Instead of rushing into the first contact the moment the Germans arrived, British fighters could choose their moment. They could climb above, get into good position, and wait for the instant the German formation had to make the decision to turn back. That moment, when German pilots start thinking about home, start scanning their gauges, start feeling that pressure, is when a fresh, hungry group of Spitfires becomes truly dangerous. Because now it's not just a dogfight, it's a chase. And a chase is where fuel kills. Some German pilots didn't fall because a bullet tore through the cockpit. They fell because they couldn't afford one more turn, one more climb, one more minute of full power. Yet the British kept pressing, refusing to let them disengage cleanly. So the fear grows, not from one big dramatic moment, but from an ugly truth. The RAF has home field advantage in time itself, and then the Luftwaffe runs into something the propaganda never prepared them for. They were told Britain was soft, an island of privileged aristocrats who wouldn't fight like real soldiers. But in the sky over England, they began meeting pilots from across the wider British world, men with different accents, different backgrounds, and very different reasons to hate the Luftwaffe. And among them were Poles, airmen who had watched their country get crushed, who escaped across a broken Europe, and who arrived in Britain with a kind of focused anger that didn't fit into neat RAF traditions. The Luftwaffe expected polite opponents. What they started to find were pilots who didn't care about looking smooth. They cared about making sure you didn't make it back across the water. For the German pilots, the scariest part wasn't just that the RAF adapted, it was who they were adapting against, because the sky over Britain didn't belong to one single type of flyer. It was a mix, different backgrounds, different accents, different life stories, united by one goal: stop you. And then there were the Poles. When Poland was overrun, many Polish airmen refused to accept it as the end. Some escaped across borders, moved through occupied territory, and eventually made it to Britain. By the time they arrived, they weren't looking for polite rules of aerial combat. They were carrying grief, rage, and a very personal score to settle. Inside the RAF, some British officers tried to shape these pilots into the usual pattern: tight formations, calm discipline, the classic textbook approach. But battlefield emotion doesn't always fit neatly into a handbook. Polish pilots gained a reputation for aggression. They liked to get close, not because they didn't understand the risks, but because they believed the surest way to finish a fight was to remove doubt. A longer range burst might damage a bomber. A closer burst might tear it apart. To a Luftwaffe crew, that shift was unsettling. The Germans had been raised on the idea that they were facing opponents who would crack under pressure, opponents who would back off when things got dangerous. Instead, they started encountering pilots who pushed forward when danger peaked. And once that reputation spreads, it changes how people fight. The moment a German pilot recognizes a unit he considers too aggressive, his brain does something terrible. It stops thinking only about the enemy aircraft and starts thinking about survival in a wider sense: fuel, altitude, escape routes, whether the channel is too far. That mental split, half fighting, half running calculations, is where mistakes happen. Over time, specific enemy markings became meaningful, not because paint on a fuselage is magic, but because it triggers memory. A pilot sees it and remembers the stories, the close-in attacks, the relentless pressure, the way these opponents didn't seem to slow down when everyone else would. The Luftwaffe had entered the battle expecting a quick collapse. Instead, the air war became a grinding test of nerves. And then came a different kind of psychological shock, one that attacked Nazi ideology directly. His name was Douglas Bader. Bader was a famous RAF fighter leader, and what made him impossible for Nazi propaganda to explain away was simple. He didn't fit their idea of the superior man. He had lost both legs in an earlier flying accident and used prosthetics, yet he still became a force in the air. For Luftwaffe pilots raised on the message that physical perfection and racial destiny made victory inevitable, Bader was an insult that could fly. He was proof that stubbornness, skill, and confidence could beat a belief system. In 1941, Bader was shot down over occupied Europe and captured. When German personnel realized who he was and realized his condition, the story spread quickly. Even when a regime tries to control what people think, certain images break through. A man missing both legs, still fighting, still refusing to be intimidated, doesn't fit the script. There's also a well-known episode tied to this capture. German ace Adolf Galland, who had a reputation for a more traditional code of honor among fighter pilots, helped arrange for Bader to receive a replacement prosthetic after one was damaged or lost. The RAF delivered it by air. Think about what that does to the average German serviceman's head. You've been told your enemy is weak. Then you learn your enemy's famous fighter leader has no legs and still fought you in the sky. Worse, you learn that even your own respected aces can't help but acknowledge the sheer boldness of it. This isn't just about one man. It's about what he represents. The idea that your opponent doesn't need to match your ideology to beat you. They just need to keep coming. Now zoom out. As the war moved forward, the sound of 1940, quick interceptions, daylight clashes, tense fuel clocks, started transforming into something heavier. By 1943 and 1944, Britain's air war wasn't only about fighters defending the island. It was about taking the fight to Germany's cities, especially at night. And for German night fighter pilots, that world was its own kind of nightmare. Picture it. You're flying in darkness so thick you can't trust your eyes. You're hunting aircraft you can't clearly see. You're guided by ground control and radar networks that are under constant pressure, jammed, disrupted, forced to adapt while you're already in the air. Some nights, it feels like trying to catch a shadow with your bare hands. Then comes the bomber that becomes a symbol of this phase of the war. The Avro Lancaster. It was large, capable, and built to carry heavy bomb loads deep into enemy territory. German night fighters weren't chasing a single target. They were facing streams of bombers stretching across the sky, long routes, coordinated timing, and defensive gunners who were trained for exactly one job: kill anything that comes too close. To make life worse, the British kept improving how their bombers protected themselves and how they managed the night battle. One device used by RAF bombers was a tail-warning radar system often known by its nickname, Monica. Its job was straightforward: give warning when something approached from behind. If you're a German pilot trying to sneak in unseen for a clean shot, a warning system like that changes the entire game. Now the bomber crew isn't blind prey. Now the hunter can be spotted, sometimes early enough for evasive action, defensive fire, or a sudden shift that ruins your approach. And that tension stacks up fast. You're already tense because you're flying in blackness. You're already tense because you know the bomber stream is huge and the odds are messy. Now you're tense because your target might sense you coming. And if you misjudge the distance, you can fly straight into concentrated defensive gunfire. But it wasn't only the bullets. It was what those bombers carried. As the war progressed, British raids included extremely large bombs, so powerful they could reshape entire blocks of a city in seconds. Some bombs required special handling and aircraft modifications because of their size. German pilots up above could watch the results: fires spreading, streets disappearing under smoke, familiar neighborhoods turning into glowing patches of destruction. It's one thing to lose a dogfight over the channel. It's another thing to witness your homeland being torn open beneath you, night after night, while you struggle to stop it. That's where the cold feeling returns. The same emotional chill German pilots sensed back in 1940 when they realized the RAF wasn't panicking. The British weren't trying to impress anyone with rage or speeches. They were simply doing the job, calmly, methodically, relentlessly. And the pressure kept building toward a breaking point on land, not just in the air, because when the war came to France in 1944, the Luftwaffe faced a new kind of terror: not duels between fighters, not night hunts in darkness, but something that hunted tanks and trucks in broad daylight with brutal efficiency. And that's where the story turns toward Normandy, toward jammed roads, trapped columns, and a low, ugly aircraft the Germans learned to fear for a very specific sound. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe's nightmare had changed shape. This wasn't about elegant, turning fights anymore. It wasn't about fuel clocks over the channel or tense night interceptions in black skies. This was about being hunted in daylight, with nowhere to hide. After the Allied landings in Normandy, German ground forces began pulling back under massive pressure. Roads filled with everything at once: tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, artillery, exhausted infantry. Movement slowed to a crawl, columns stretched for miles. And once the sun came up, those roads turned into traps. That's when the RAF unleashed one of its most feared tools, the Hawker Typhoon. The Typhoon wasn't graceful like the Spitfire. It didn't look delicate or refined. It was thick, powerful, and built around a massive engine. To German soldiers on the ground, it didn't feel like a fighter at all. It felt like a blunt instrument. The Typhoon carried rockets, heavy ones, designed to tear apart armor, vehicles, and anything unlucky enough to be nearby. These weren't precision duels between pilots. These were violent, one-sided attacks delivered at terrifying speed. German troops gave the Typhoon a name that said everything: Jabo, short for fighter bomber. The RAF developed a system called cab rank. Typhoons would circle above the battlefield, waiting. When ground forces spotted a target, an armored column, a traffic jam, a defensive position, they called it in by radio. And then the Typhoon would tip its wing and dive. Veteran German tank commanders, men who had survived the Eastern Front and seen horrors on a scale most people never imagine, wrote about this fear later. They said the Typhoon didn't sound like an airplane. It sounded like something tearing the sky open. The rockets left the wings with a sharp hiss. Impact came almost immediately. Vehicles exploded, tanks were flipped or torn apart, roads became fields of fire and smoke. From the air, RAF pilots could see entire columns frozen in place, nowhere to turn, nowhere to escape. From the ground, German soldiers saw death arriving from above with no warning and no defense, and the Luftwaffe, mostly absent. By this stage of the war, German air power was stretched thin, trained pilots were gone, fuel was scarce. Aircraft were fewer. The air superiority that once felt guaranteed was now a memory. The promised miracle weapons didn't appear in time, so the Typhoons worked methodically, one strike after another, breaking the retreat into chaos. The destruction around the Falaise pocket was so severe that even Allied pilots flying overhead later described the scene as overwhelming. Smoke, fire, and the unmistakable signs of total collapse. This was the end result of a psychological war that began years earlier. And that brings us back to the question, why did German pilots fear the RAF so deeply? It wasn't because the British were louder. The Americans would later arrive with massive formations, overwhelming numbers, and relentless daylight bombing. The Soviets fought with fury, sacrifice, and scale that defied comprehension. But the British were different. They fought in a way that attacked the German worldview itself. Nazi ideology was built on seriousness, on ritual, hierarchy, perfection, and the belief that discipline alone guaranteed victory. Everything had to look impressive. Everything had to project power. The RAF didn't play that game. British pilots wore loose scarves and half-unbuttoned tunics. They joked before missions. They brought dogs into briefing rooms. They spoke calmly over the radio while flying straight into danger. Not because they didn't care, but because refusing to act impressed was part of the fight. To a German pilot raised on rigid doctrine, that attitude was deeply unsettling. If the enemy was supposed to be weak, why weren't they afraid? If they were amateurs, why were they winning? Every time a British pilot calmly reported enemy positions while tracer rounds filled the sky, it chipped away at the idea of German inevitability. Every time a Spitfire appeared where it shouldn't be, still diving, still chasing, still fighting, it rewrote the rules in real time. The Luftwaffe didn't just lose aircraft, it lost certainty. And once certainty is gone, confidence collapses fast. By the end of the war, the sound that haunted German pilots wasn't a single engine or weapon. It was the memory of that early realization, the moment over England in 1940, when they learned the RAF wasn't panicking. The calm voices, the perfect timing, the refusal to quit. That cold silence wasn't weakness. It was control. If this story gave you a new way to see the air war, give the video a like and ring the bell. There are more moments like this you won't want to miss. In the end, the image that defines it all isn't just burning wreckage or shattered cities. It's a young pilot sitting on a grass airfield, helmet off, waiting for the call to scramble, tired, determined, looking up at the sky. Not because he expects glory, but because someone has to be there when the enemy comes. And that quiet readiness, steady, stubborn, unshaken, was something the Luftwaffe never truly learned how to defeat.